All right, so I've put together a bunch of tips and tricks for starting out as a tutor, whether you're interested or have just started or might be interested in the future. This is also applicable if you're a classroom volunteer, but it is, again, targeted towards more of a one-on-one or a small group setting. So here's just a picture of the big stack of textbooks that I dug through to pull out some of these tips and tricks, but also it's informed by just practicing. So student characteristics is something we like to go over. Funds of knowledge is a term that we use to reference and acknowledge that our adult students, immigrants, refugees, asylees, have been through a lot of the times, and so they have life experience and educational experience, and so finding out about that and using that to inform instruction and content and bring in things students might be interested about, or may already know, and building on that is part of our job as a responsive instructor or facilitator. So motivation in the midst of outside responsibilities, we typically see that our adult students have more motivation to come to class, succeed, carry through with things because they're taking time out of their free time, busy schedule. A lot of them are parents, work 1 or 2 jobs, caretakers for their parents. So we've had a lot of comments from our volunteers who have come from the public school system about the difference in motivation and engagement that they are able to see between our students and the, not to brag on, I was one of those, high school students who did, anyways. We also see that adults have a more developed self-concept, as in, like, I'm an adult, I can do things, I know how to, like, change a tire, and anyways, they're used to functioning in their society. And then so that's a bit of a double-edged sword because culture shock, suddenly not knowing how to do things and asking for help, that can be difficult. You could be very anxious about making mistakes, being perceived as a fool. So our job is to lower that effective filter, right? So that learning can kind of get through, among other things. Their job is a lot of things. And then adults are also able to typically set and pursue their goals more strategically and intentionally. Not to say that kids don't do this, not to say that all adults do this, because some of them definitely don't. Just trends again. So, and then we also see heavy influence of first language, which is also known as L1. You might see that throughout the presentation. And so first language and home culture, and we'll get a bit more into that. One point I wanted to make is that it's important to know whether or not your student is literate in their first language or another language. If they are, that's great. If not, you're in for a fun ride. But we have a lot of resources to support you in this. So tutor characteristics, these are mostly from the textbooks that you saw earlier. I would say one of the most important ones is commitment and follow through, showing up, because if not, you're not really a tutor, so we can't really describe your characteristics. So learner-centeredness, this is again just the responsive and engaged as a facilitator. So that means, taking time to learn about your student and their culture and their family and using that to shape instruction and goals, which can be modified by outside stipulations. Like if you're specifically working on pronunciation with them, then don't spend too much time. Anyways, moving on. Organized and prepared. So this includes keeping records of student progress, noting things that they are struggling with, how you address that. If you're with an if you're with an organization, like, so example, we have our tutors mark the days and hours that they meet just for our record keeping purposes, but then also having enough content prepared to fill your time. Rule of thumb that I was always told is have more activities and content planned than you think you have time for, because sometimes, like, you have no problem and your student breezes right through something you thought would take like 15 minutes, it takes like 3. So yeah, just respecting their time and commitment in that way of being prepared. Being flexible and adaptable, because you are both adults with busy schedules. You could, like hit a deer or, get sick. So just having open lines of communication for that, whether that be through an interpreter or not, which we'll cover a bit on the next slide or so. Important to be enthusiastic and encouraging, sense of humor, and that just gets at the importance of relationship building. Going back to being flexible and adaptable, if your student or one of your students in your group is habitually not showing up or being spotty, even if it is for a very good reason, like they got a new job, which is great, or their parent is sick, which is sad, you should tell us, because we have, just because of the demand for classes and tutors, we want to fill that spot with a student who can make it more regularly, both to respect your time, but also and we'll hold the other student, until their schedule clears up usually, but just let us know. So cultural awareness, sensitivity, and responsiveness. Again, that's just the onus on you as a facilitator to, be a learner of your learner a bit, to a reasonable extent. Again, if you have students from 12 different home countries and cultures, then we don't expect you to become an expert in every single one, but just, it's a bit of a give and take. So, which I'm sure you guys already know. And then, patience, responsibility. Patience, definitely, sometimes we find it frustrating or repetitive to go over these minutia or these everyday things that are boring to us, but a lot of times students, it's like bread and butter, right? Something like a interaction with a cashier or whatever the automatic checkout tells you. So moving on, considering cultures. Something that is interesting and we find is varied is the perception of education and how much prestige is tied to that or not in their home culture, and how much prestige is associated with the position of teacher. So sometimes they may be afraid to question you, or they may be uncomfortable with a more participatory learning setup because we view it as a more traditional education. And so like a lecture, standing and talking, right? So raising your hand to ask questions seems disrespectful in certain contexts, not necessarily ours as much, maybe in the bigger universe. Anyways, and so that's also tied to the power distance index and how authority is viewed. And so that just changes culturally. And that's not to say that trying to have a more back and forth dialogue is disrespectful of their, more hierarchical worldview, but just it'll take some getting used to. So these are not dichotomies, but they are more two ends of a continuum that cultures tend to vary on. This is from the Culture Map book. And so they're saying that culture sets a normal or acceptable range of, communicating. Cultures can be more explicit communicators like us in the US, or more implicit like in China is a big example. So you've got to read between the lines more. And so when you have the two cultures overlapping, you can communicate well and not completely offend each other because there is an overlapping range of acceptability. So that's that concept. It's very interesting, and I'll go into it later more in another presentation, but the ones I wanted to hit on specifically for tutoring is communication in multicultural settings. The more explicit it is, the more you can get people to paraphrase back to you, the more you can repeat and write it down. The less miscommunication there will be. This is for things like meeting times or homework directions usually, just because you have it's just a good lowest common denominator. There's too much math on this slide. And then evaluating, we tend to direct negative feedback versus indirect negative. This is just being aware of people's sensitivity to feedback, and this is also very impacted by personality. So I'm just being aware of that. But the example that the book gave was a lot of times when we give feedback, or a model that at least is in the business world, because this is actually a business textbook, is, sandwiching. So you give a positive feedback and negative feedback and then positive feedback. And so a person from another culture might walk away saying, wow, I'm doing great. Even if it's your penmanship is nice, your work performance is bad, but you have really a nice email signature, so they might have the two positives cancel out anyway. So just being aware of that. And then I am actually going to move on. So, because we have a lot to cover. Logistics. So figuring out how often to meet, what days of the week to meet, how long your actual tutoring session will last, whether it be for 3 months, a year, or if there's like an endpoint, a goal to meet, like if you pass your citizenship test, or if you, test into a certain level at in another, ESL class. The length of your tutoring sessions, so we have certain stipulations from the Department of Education that tutors have to meet at least 3 hours per week with their students. So that would be an example of an outside stipulation, but it is up to them how they fill those hours. It could be a combination of in-person and online, etc. And then again, for the record keeping, it's important to be able to show that to the department. And then deciding a place, again, this could be hybrid if you want, like one day in person, one day not. But whether or not you have a set place or it changes, like if one day you want to go to the grocery store together or go through, like going to a gas station, just being able to communicate that well and in a timely manner. Although we would recommend that consistency is good, especially starting out. And then online, consider the accessibility for both you and your student, whether that be your devices or your internet access, and then tech savvy for both of you, and whether or not you can communicate like technical problems. So like with our level 1 class, we have one teacher who has like a little, she has a printed out sign that says like, oh, you're on mute. So she has the button with the mute, and so that usually helps the level 1, the low level students know that they're on mute. So just figuring out ways around that, because it's totally possible. Have contingency plans if your Wi-Fi is out. Can you do a phone call or a meetup if you live close? Or if Zoom isn't working for some reason, can you meet on FaceTime, or even go like old school and do Skype? And then we also have found one last thing, that online format requires more intentional practice with writing, just because students have small screens. It's hard to see, like they can't see what you're writing sometimes. We found that you need at least 28-point font, I believe I was told, if you're making a PowerPoint and you want your students to be able to read it easily from their devices. So just kind of awareness of the format and delivery. So overview of the language skills real quick, and these should be familiar to you. If you think of how children learn language, they hear, and then they start trying to repeat what they hear. They speak, they output, and then they learn their letters and reading, and then writing is usually considered to be the last and more advanced of the skills. And so again, the categories of input, output, but then also spoken and written are good for figuring out how to create activities and target certain areas for growth. So students may have these skills developed asymmetrically. A lot of times you have very strong speakers and listeners, but they may be weaker in reading and writing, or vice versa. But again, there's any kind of variation, because there's no one size fits all when it comes to, how do I move my face? When it comes to our students, or us for that matter. So everyone's special. Sorry, that wasn't sarcastic. That it kind of was. Anyways, so there's also cultural influences. So again, their first language, which if it's a small ethnic language, may not actually have an orthography. It may not have a writing system. They may not be aware of spelling patterns or a sound and meaning, or a symbol and sound relationship. Depending on their proficiency level, adult students can typically handle technical discussions about grammar. So like, I wouldn't recommend sentence diagramming, actually. It shows you the relationship of the words, but it doesn't tell you like what an adjective is besides like on a slanted line, or like pronunciation. So you could go over articulation and phonation and how, so you can do more technical discussions when you feel your students are ready for it. So assessment, and there will probably be another presentation on assessment, but the important thing is basically to find out if they're literate in their first language, and if not, you'll have a lot of groundwork to lay. But again, we're here to support you in that. So the goals of assessment should be learner-centered first, but they are to kind of get the bearings and provide a good starting point to help strategically inform instruction. So it helps us frame, both us and the students frame mistakes as information to then learn from and then mark progress, because everyone likes seeing that they do better. We have a lot of informal assessments that we do, and so we'll go over some of that and what that looks like, and something else with assessment. I think I'll just move on. Yes, so assessment may not actually be your job if you're, like, for example, we do assessment and intake at Catholic Charities, and then we can give you leveled materials that fit your student based on that, but it might be a good idea to, ask a supervisor, someone about the student's testing level or this or that. And so what we do is we have intake forms, right? And so here's an example of it, and we'll get to it, but asking for that form and going over it with the student as way of introduction may be a good way to, one, start building relationship, but two, figure out their speaking fluency and listening comprehension. So if you believe you'll need an interpreter, that's something to arrange beforehand, whether it be through your organization or through, I've had luck with this app/website called Tarjimly, and it's free, relatively on-the-spot interpretation service, either spoken or written. And so it's a company made or started by refugees for refugees specifically, and again, it's for work-related purposes. So, so here's an example of an information card from one of the books. And then it's also recommended to either keep on the back of it or keep with it the specific student goals, if you don't already have them. Oh, sorry, no, not on the back, that's right here. So keep a list of issues that you want to target, whether it be a specific phoneme, a specific pronunciation problem, or a concept, or this or that. So relationship development, this is fun because it rhymes, but mainly it's here to say that, like, it's normal to feel like you're failing at certain points, usually towards the beginning, and we are here to support you and give you materials, sit in with you, help you with assessment, etc. So forming, storming, norming, performing, adjourning. So it gets worse before it gets better sometimes. And so you can look more into this if you want. It's kind of interesting, the Tuckman model of relationship development. Okay, so we're going to take a brief pause and get into the actual tips and tricks.